that we're having. This is a very interesting program that we're having this evening. We have three panelists with three really diverse backgrounds. First of all, let me start with Congressman John Kline from Minnesota. John's a 25-year veteran of the U.S. Marines, a decorated helicopter pilot. He carried the nuclear football, which is the briefcase that has the codes in it, standing alongside Presidents Carter and Presidents Reagan, just in case nuclear weapons had to be used. In addition, John was also a security advisor to these presidents and worked in that area while he was in the military. He was elected to Congress, served on the Armed Services Committee and on the committee dealing with education and labor. He and our other Congressman, Dave Loebsack, shared those two committees for a period of time. Dave Loebsack is a Democrat, a retired member from Congress, member of Congress from Iowa. I had the opportunity to serve with both of these gentlemen, really great guys, running against the current of what you see as some type of not optimistic view of members of Congress. These are guys that believed in getting things done. And Dave is a retired political science professor from Cornell College. He also served on Energy and Commerce, which is in charge of examining and promulgating laws and regulations dealing with all forms of not only commerce, but energy. And as we know, that's a big factor going on with this present situation in the Ukraine. And then our third panelist is somebody I've known for almost 50 years. Nadia Johnson lives in Rockford. I had the privilege of knowing her parents and her brother. And her parents escaped from the Ukraine, went to Poland. They went from Stalin to Hitler. And then Nadia was born in a displaced persons camp in Germany in 1946. Is that correct, Nadia?
Correct. 1940.
In 1946. What's interesting about her life, and she may not realize that, is that my dad had a grocery store in Rockford, Illinois in 1948, across the street from Morris Kennedy Grade School, then the Kinrock Community Center. It was a bus stop. And at that bus stop, a lot of people come in from displaced persons camp in Europe. The first person they met to help them out was my dad. And he helped settle tons and tons of people from the Ukraine. And so we're going to have a very lively conversation this evening. And Catherine, did you want to say something?
Yeah, let me start here. If I can get my slides to work. Oops, wrong direction. Okay. I wanted to just, before we start, just give us a little context for the conversation we're going to have. For anybody who's maybe not sure exactly where Ukraine is, I want to make sure that we all see it's right here, kind of nestled in this kind of part of what used to be in the Soviet Union, but now is no longer, and is clearly, this area down here is the Crimea, which we'll hear about, and you've probably heard about in the news, an area that was taken back by Russia in 2014. It has a long history as part of Russia, but became part of Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union. So we're looking at kind of this, this part of Eastern Europe here. Also, this is a closer up map. It's a little outdated in that it's from the beginning of March. So it's about a month, about 5 weeks old. So some of the areas under control are different, but I wanted us to have at least some kind of mental picture of Ukraine and the major cities, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, which has been so much in the news, Odessa as well. Many of these places, we've been hearing about in the news. And so I thought it would be useful to have that to look at for a few minutes. And then I just wanted to kind of make a little bit of a comparison and contrast with the Cold War. As a diplomatic historian, that's kind of the way I approach these sorts of things. And to me, this clash in Europe is both similar and different than the US and Soviet clashes of the Cold War era. I did not make the distinction in the differences that this has actually got kind of a hot war going on. And it is still in some ways a proxy type war. Ukraine is essentially a proxy of sorts for NATO and the West. But some of the similarities, I think, are pretty basic. The international tension, what's happening there is affecting relations of countries all over the place. Relations with China, relations not only with Russia, but throughout Europe. So it's just kind of ratcheting up the tension level, I think. It's also a time when the world is taking sides. It's kind of hard to be neutral in this kind of a situation. And while some countries are trying to be neutral, most of the world is taking one side or the other. There's also similarities in the rhetoric that each side is using about each other, as well as the kind of disinformation and information flow that's coming out of that region. It's interesting. I saw a headline the other day that says, the Pentagon, Ukraine officials, and Russian officials all disagree on what happened. And the perfect example today is the Russian ship that sank. And, the Pentagon says one thing, Ukraine government another, and the Russian government. So even just trying to get clear information is one thing. And then, of course, the level of disinformation that Russia has been putting out to its own people as well as to the rest of the world is very similar to the Cold War era. A lot of, some of the differences that I think other people will also address, some of the lack of communication between both sides. I know that during the Cold War, there was probably more communication between military leaders in the West and military leaders in the Soviet Union than the general public knew about. But those conversations did happen, and there seems to be a decided lack of those conversations happening now. The threat of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons being used. So it's not that those weapons didn't exist in the Cold War, but we don't live in the world of mutual assured destruction in the same way we did during the Cold War. There's still more than enough weapons to destroy the world over, but the dynamics are different, and the discussion about tactical use of a nuclear or chemical or biological weapon is not something that was discussed much, at least publicly, in the Cold War. I'm, not going to, I don't know what was discussed behind the scenes, and maybe some of our panelists can speak to that. But we also are witnessing very dysfunctional diplomacy, not among the Western allies, but between the West and the Russians. And And so that is not helping the situation. So I thought that might give us a little bit of context, kind of think about it in the ways it's similar and different to the Cold War. And so at that point, I will turn it over to Nadia, who's going to talk about her experiences.
Well, thank you, Catherine. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. My experience is really my parents' experience. And so I'm going to go back to the 1930s, early 1930s. Well, my parents were both born in West Ukraine. And they didn't know each other back then, of course. They lived in small villages in the West Ukraine region, just probably in about central Ukraine. So when Joseph Stalin started coming into Ukraine and taking over and starving the people of Ukraine, both my parents' families took their children, which would have been my mother and my father and their siblings, and walked to Poland. So what I saw when I was watching the news when this war first started, it just really gripped my heart, because it was like I was seeing what my parents went through with these children and their parents walking with their suitcases, leaving everything that they had and walking into another country, Poland. And again, Poland was so gracious in taking in all these refugees from the Ukraine. And so my parents' family settled in Poland. So my mother was probably in grade school, and my father, and so they grew up in Poland. Well, then when Hitler occupied Poland, my parents were older. I think my mother was 19, my father was 16. And so the Nazis needed workers in Germany. And so they came into a lot of the Polish villages and towns and just literally took the teenagers back to Germany for forced labor. So my father was assigned to work on the Autobahn, that German highway that Hitler built with forced labor. And my mother was assigned to a restaurant in another city. They didn't know each other back then. And so that was their lives. And my mother received a letter from my grandmother back in Poland that my grandmother was very sick. So my mother was given a 1-week visa to go visit her mother and just check on her well-being. Well, when she got there, my grandmother was very, very ill. And so my mother overstayed her visa for 1 week. So when she got back to Germany, into the restaurant, the Gestapo was waiting for her and arrested her. And she was put into a concentration camp. Many people aren't aware that there were thousands of concentration camps, not as large as some of the ones we hear about, like Auschwitz. So my mother was put into a concentration camp in a city called Lodz, L-O-D-E-S, Germany, and the concentration camp was called Lodz. As time went on in the camp, one day the guard came through her barracks and was asking, was there anyone in the women's barracks that knew how to cook German food? Because apparently the commandant of the camp hated Polish cooking. So since my mother had worked in a German restaurant, once she had been taken,
we may have lost her connection. Catherine or Don, I don't know if you want to reach out to see.
Don, can you reach out to Nadia?
We may want to move to the next panelist for now.
Yeah, she's speaking now, but she's muted. Nicole, can you unmute her?
Yes. There we go.
There
Looks
we
like
go.
she's back.
I'm sorry, I got kicked off for a second. So let me just quickly go through my story. So my mother ended up in concentration camp, cooking for the commandant's family. And as the war started coming to an end, many of us know that Hitler started accelerating the exterminations rather than stopping them. And so every day, more and more people were being taken from my mother's camp to the larger ones where more exterminations were. And one morning her number was called and she thought, well, that's it. She's going to the one of the larger camps to be exterminated, because they all knew what was happening. And unbeknownst to her, the commandant, she believes, had her given her papers, had the guard give her papers, and she was escorted to the gate outside the camp and told to walk into the city of Lodz. And they freed her. And so my mother always believed that the commandant had saved her from extermination. So there she was in Lodz, and from Lodz, she was sent back to the restaurant where she had worked before. And lo and behold, that was the restaurant where my father ate his lunch every day. And so they met. They got married, the war came to an end, and they were displaced persons because they were Ukrainian. So the Americans built a camp, a refugee camp in Wiesbaden, Germany, and that's where we have the Air Force Base today. And that's where I was born, in Wiesbaden, Germany. And so for 3 years, my family waited for a sponsor to sponsor us from the United States to bring us to America. And a little church, a little Baptist church in New Jersey, sponsored us. And so our family came to America. The difference back then, as opposed to now when refugees come over, is the families had to sign a contract with the government that they would not receive any help, financial help of any kind from the US government for 5 years. That refugees coming over had to make it on their own, or they would be sent back. And so that was our experience, a little different from today. We couldn't get medical help, so we all helped each other. And so I grew up having many, many refugees coming into our home. We always had a family that was living with us at one time or another, probably up until I was 10 years old. We came in 1949, I was 3. And so what I see happening today is it's almost like Putin is the modern day Stalin, where he really doesn't care what the world thinks. What he wants is power. And it's forcing, I believe, the whole world to open their eyes to the incredible devastation that someone like Stalin or Putin can do to the entire world. I do have relatives that are still in the Ukraine, and right now they also have walked to Poland from where they lived in West Ukraine. So again, it's like my family is once again reliving the history that our parents and grandparents had. And so that's my story. The one thing I do want to add is that the Ukrainian and Russian people really like each other. There is no animosity between the Ukrainian and Russian people. My second cousin, who came over 20 years ago to the United States, he married a Russian girl. And so they live near Chicago, and she speaks to him in Russian, and he speaks to her in Ukraine. And they speak to me in English. And so that's my story. And I'll turn it back over to you, Catherine.
Okay, thank you. That's great. I think we'll wait and do questions at the end. So I'd like to turn it over to John to give us a military analysis of things.
Okay, Catherine, thank you. And thanks very much, Nadia, for your terrific story. In the earlier discussion with Don Manzullo, we were talking a little bit about the nuclear issue, and Catherine brought it up in her earlier remarks about mutually assured destruction. So I'm going to jump completely out of my notes here and go to that issue first for just a couple of minutes. A couple of things. We're seeing something now that was not really that kind of an issue back in the Cold War, the 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s. And that's the sort of nuclear extortion that we're seeing from Putin, where by implying his possible use of a tactical nuclear weapon, he's got the world frozen. So there's been much discussion about whether or not you could send in NATO troops or MiG-29s that Poland wanted to give to Ukraine via Germany and the United States and all that. And everybody has turned out to be frozen because they're afraid that if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon, that it will cause a rapid expansion. I worry about that a lot, frankly, because if he can use that tactical nuclear threat here and freeze us, well, just for example, why couldn't the Chinese do that? If they said, we're going to go in and take Taiwan, which they claim anyway, and if you try to do anything to stop us, we may use tactical nuclear weapons. So that is something for us to be thinking about, concerned about, and for policymakers to address. On the somewhat larger question of control of nuclear weapons, I have great confidence, because I was an integral part of it, that in the United States and the NATO countries of the West, there is very solid control of nuclear weapons. There is not. When people find out that I carried the nuclear codes, they sometimes sort of imply that, well, if you open that up, the president could just push a button and launch nuclear missiles. No, doesn't work that way, can't work that way, isn't built that way. The system won't do that. So I have confidence that we have control here. I don't have any confidence about the Russians on anything. The actions here with the invasion of the Ukraine, whether they think they're Russian or not, is abhorrent. The world is saying it's abhorrent, and yet we're still frozen because of this implied possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. The military action took virtually everyone by surprise. The Russians, the Americans, NATO, the world, because the expectation was from the intelligence agencies that the Russians, who have vastly larger forces than Ukraine has, would roll in, go to Kyiv, which most of us were calling Kiev, which is Russian as I understand it, and take over the government in a matter of days. As we know, that did not happen. The Ukrainians turned out to be very resilient. Their president has become an international hero. The Ukrainians have fought well and are fighting well, and the Russians are proving to be incredibly inept. Many of us who looked at this over a lot of years, most of my life, were not surprised that they're inept because of how they're put together. Their command and control systems are poor. They hold decision-making at high levels. They don't have a non-commissioned officer system like we have in the West, not only the United States, but in NATO. So decision-making gets disrupted. So their morale is poor, their tactics are poor, their leadership is poor, the equipment's in bad shape. We shouldn't be too surprised. Nevertheless, we were surprised. And if you were to look at the map that Catherine put up, there was a time, as it was in her second map, where it showed the Russians were getting entrenched from the north, up south of Belarus, up near Kyiv, and all the way around towards Odessa. That's not the case now. The Ukrainians have pushed back. The Russians have pulled away from Kyiv. They're concentrating their efforts in the south and in the east, where they're closely abutted to Russia. One of the concerns that's been expressed, and I was worried about, and I think most observers were, was, well, the Ukrainians are brave people. They're in the terrible position of millions of their countrymen, women and children, are being forced to evacuate and going to Poland. And men were being forced to stay and fight, but they appear to be doing so willingly. They're fighting for their families and for their homes. The Russians are not. Many of them are conscripts that don't care about this, don't understand it. They're poorly trained. And as I said, their equipment is falling apart. But the Ukrainians needed equipment, and they're getting it. There's a lot of discussion about the MiG-29s that Poland was trying to give to them, and that give it to Germany, and then have the Americans backfill those aircraft. But setting that aside, I've got a list here I was just looking at, the Pentagon put out, that we have provided to the Ukrainians over 1,400 Stinger surface-to-air missiles, over 5,000 Javelin anti-armor system, over 50 million rounds small arms ammunition, 7,000 small arms, 45,000 sets of body armor, very importantly, night vision devices and tactical secure communications, and more. The Ukrainians are using them well. I was looking at some video just a day or two ago, nighttime pictures of Russian helicopters flying along and being shot down one after the other by presumably Stinger missiles, certainly surface-to-air missiles. As I watched that, I thought, well, there is no way, if those were American helicopters and American forces, we wouldn't fly like that. We would have night vision goggles. We would be flying those helicopters dispersed. We would be below 50 feet. We'd be going 150 miles an hour. We would have air cover. We would have covering fires, just different tactics than what the Russians are using in their sort of hidebound way. I'm not saying that American helicopters couldn't get shot down, but to watch what I watched just 2 days ago, it's just incredibly inept on the part of the Russians, and we're seeing that everywhere. A lot of discussion about lessons learned here. And one of the things that's been bandied about a lot is, well, we see that tanks are no good because you can shoot tanks with a missile, and so there shouldn't be any tanks. Well, that's a good debate to have and an argument about how many tanks you need and so forth. But here's the thing. You definitely do not need tanks lined up on a highway, nose to tail, driving along like they're going to roll into Kyiv. Tanks have to be fought like other forces. They need to be dispersed. They need to get overhead cover if they can get it. They should have aircraft overhead. They should have supporting troops, ground and artillery. The Russians are doing none of that. They literally are lining up on a highway, and you have all seen the aerial photos of their convoy of tanks and trucks going down the highway. That's staggeringly inept. It's almost unbelievable. I was a professional soldier, so to speak, and been studying this for my whole life, I suppose. But I don't think you need to do that. I think when I was a second lieutenant, I knew better than that. You don't do that. You don't line up your tanks and trucks and send them down the highway. It's absolutely remarkable. So we need to be careful. I guess what I'm saying here is we need to be careful about what conclusions we draw and lessons we learn. I happen to believe we need to do everything in our power to help the Ukrainians. I know there's some debate about that, believe it or not. But clearly, when we can provide them the warfighting and logistic support that they need, they're doing a heck of a fine job. And I think that we should definitely keep doing that. I was surprised to hear today while I was out running errands that the flagship, the Russian flagship in the Black Sea, is at the bottom of the ocean now. Well, it was the biggest ship in the Black Sea. It was a cruiser, not a battleship, as some people say. The Slava class. The Moskva was presumed to be able to just dominate the Black Sea. And the next thing you know, it's apparently being towed, and then it's in the bottom of the ocean. So this fight turns in ways that many of us didn't expect. And I think that the Ukrainians will do a fantastic job, even though they're getting hit hard down south now, where the Russians are pushing down at Mariupol towards the sea. We do need to be concerned for them. But the big picture, and maybe Dave will talk about this, is what happens as we go forward, because it's clear the Russians are just not going to roll through. And the Ukrainians are caught up in this quasi-diplomatic threat thing. So they're kind of stuck defending where I'm sure they'd like to be attacking in some cases. But they're doing a fine job. I'm proud of them every day. Sometimes I'm still just shaking my head, as I was today when I heard, oh my gosh, the flagship of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea is at the bottom of the ocean. Pretty amazing stuff. I'm pulling for them every day. I'll be glad to address any questions if people have them later. Back to you, Catherine or Dave, I guess.
Okay, Dave, you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm unmuted now, right? Okay, thanks. Well, I do want to thank Catherine and Don for helping put this thing together. I don't know if I made a mistake. I don't think I did when I told Don I'd come to Rockford University, because I'm never going to see the end of this, I think, but Don has been really great at convincing me to do more and more things. But I do appreciate it, Don, a lot. You're doing great work for the university there. And Catherine, thank you for putting this together too. You and I might have a conversation sometime about some of the points that you made at the outset, or maybe we'll get to that this evening too. It'd be fantastic. And Nadia, thank you so much for your story. We've heard so many stories about Ukrainians on the news in the present day. And just thank you for sharing what you had to share about your parents and about how you got here and all that. And John, thank you, because we did serve on those committees together. And we usually didn't vote together, but we did respect each other. And as I mentioned, I got my own kids now in the Marine Corps, and they're going to be colonels soon. And the longer I'm around them, the more I appreciate your service, John, and all the sacrifices you had to make and all the great things you did. So thank you so much. Little background, I was on armed services, Don said, for 8 years, and I'm not a military person myself. I had no idea I was going to get on the Armed Services Committee, and I made that decision to do that for a variety of reasons. But it allowed me to travel overseas and visit our troops over a dozen times in various parts of the world, mostly in the war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. But also I did make a trip to NATO headquarters in Brussels. I was there for a few days, went on one of these congressional delegations just a few years ago to Poland and Estonia and Ukraine. And in fact, I was there with colleagues of mine on the day, literally, that the news broke about President Trump trying to convince President Zelensky that he needed to get dirt on Hunter Biden, and if he didn't, he was going to, withhold some of the military assistance. And of course, we know that that's what led to Donald Trump's first impeachment. But I was there that morning, and our then charge d'affaires, we call him offhandedly the ambassador, but he came in, and he's Bill Taylor. He's been on the news a lot. He picked us up early in the morning, and we all looked at him and said, it's going to be an interesting day. And he said, so you watch CNN? And we said, we did, of course. And we wanted to meet with President Zelensky, but we didn't have the opportunity to do that while we were there because this story broke about that. And now here we are in a situation where we actually have bipartisan support, I think, and that's great for more assistance to the Ukrainians. And I agree completely with John, what he said. We've got to do everything that we possibly can to help these folks. And I've been reminded every day about the time that I was there, that when our delegation took part in a daily memorial service that happened at the Ministry of Defense in Kyiv, honoring the Ukrainians who at that time were dying over in the Donbass. They were dying fighting these Russian-backed separatists at that time. And not very many Americans really knew that that was going on at that time. But this has been going on for quite some time. They've been fighting these folks for a number of years. Now they're fighting the Russians directly. I want to mention how happy I am that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that NATO, has done what it has done these past several weeks. Because when I went to NATO in Brussels a number of years ago, when I went to the Parliamentary Assembly, NATO Parliamentary Assembly, it was parliamentarians, members of the legislatures from all these different NATO countries that were gathered, and we were in over in I'm trying to think where we were at the moment, but anyway, it was in one of the countries there, and it was really fantastic that we were able to talk to these folks. But there was so little support in many ways for NATO at that time. It was for drawing down American forces, not for ramping it up. It was fights constantly over making sure that the nation states of NATO put in their 2% of their GDP to pay their fair share. And Donald Trump, I thought, actually did a good job convincing them to do better while he was president. I didn't like his, the way he went about it, but he got it done. But when I was there, it was in Prague, there were not that many people who were all excited about NATO. And it really took, I think, Putin and what he's been doing to galvanize support for NATO. And now we see a potential expansion of NATO. Finland, that has been essentially neutral for all these years, and Sweden, no one thought these two countries would ever be seriously thinking about joining NATO, but they may very well join by the summer is what it's looking like. Finland may be before Sweden. And NATO has done a fantastic job. Germany, which has a history because of what happened in World War II, of not wanting to send significant troops or supplies or heavy weaponry, especially overseas, now is beginning to do just that. And they're going to put even more into their military. And they also, as we know, decided to back out of Nord Stream 2, which is the gas pipeline that comes essentially from Russia to Germany. And that's a sacrifice on the part of the Germans. But that's a big deal that they decided to do that. So some good things have been coming out of this, and I think we're going to continue to get that kind of support from NATO for Ukraine. I don't want to be too optimistic about what's going to happen in this next surge, and John, you may agree with me about this. It is maybe going to be better terrain for the Russians. Maybe they're going to learn something themselves from their failures trying to march on Kyiv. But this is going to be tough over in that part of the country because it is flatter and not as many forests and all the rest, and it may be something that's a little more amenable to what the Russians do in their kind of warfare. I hope not, and I hope we're sending the Ukrainians enough equipment that they can do a good job staving off this assault. I'm going to go on now and just mention a few things about sort of implications for the international system and the whole balance of power issue. I taught international relations and comparative politics for 24 years before I got elected to Congress. I think the first thing we should keep in mind, and I think Catherine mentioned this, the whole world is not for Ukraine at this point. The whole world is not against Russia. we need to keep that in mind when we think about this as soberly and as clear-headed as we possibly can. The Chinese are, as we know, not really taking a stand on this. We have a lot of African countries that have relations with China, obviously, and with Russia as well, that are not taking our position on this. We had a lot of no votes, in the UN recently against the Russians. And there are many other countries. Brazil is I spent a lot of time in Brazil when I was at Cornell College. They're a strong country. They're a country that matters. And I think that their president has an affinity to Donald Trump, and I think he has an affinity to Putin as well, Bolsonaro. He's a lot like him in some ways. He's an authoritarian wannabe of sorts, but nonetheless, they're kindred spirits. So we have to be thinking about this, I think, in a clear-headed sort of way. NATO has only strengthened. That's the good news. And I think going forward, that could be a real positive, obviously, not only with respect to this conflict, but going forward as well, depending on what happens with Putin, depending on how this all turns out. I think we have to be thoughtful about what have been sort of prevailing norms of non-aggression and state sovereignty, which is something that goes back to 1646, right, if you will. But state sovereignty has been such an important, nation state sovereignty, important principle and concept in our international system for so long. And this is being violated by Putin now. Now he has different ideas about Ukraine as a nation, whether it should even exist as a nation. But those ideas shouldn't really matter in a sense, because we have this system in place, and Ukraine is an independent sovereign nation state, and its borders never should have been violated, not in Crimea, not in the East, and certainly not what's been happening recently. But we have to think about that and what might happen if Putin does succeed. And there are folks who are talking about Putin possibly going into Moldova or some of these other countries, or maybe even NATO countries, maybe Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. I think he'll be far more hesitant to go into a NATO country, because I think he believes, he better for his own sake, that Article 5 will be invoked. And the United States, we will come to the assistance of a country in NATO that is invaded by Russia. There's no question about that. I think we have to think about the future of democracy. And look, we have to face the facts, and I'm almost done, that Ukraine has not been an ideal democracy since it began. And in fact, our delegation met with the Ukrainian government officials when we were there to talk to them about corruption, to talk to them about free and fair elections, and to make sure that the system could be reformed so that they could have a democracy, a fully functioning democracy. So those are issues that we have to be thinking about, depending on what happens in Ukraine going forward. And finally, American leadership, and we can talk a lot about that, but I do think that in this case, I think Trump exhibited some leadership when he finally did send a lot of this weaponry to Ukraine, when he got past the Hunter Biden episode and all of that. But really, with Biden as president, he's done I think a pretty darn good job of uniting NATO and standing up to Putin on this. Maybe he didn't do it as quickly as he could have, but now we're there, and it's good to see that we have bipartisan support getting behind him. And we've got to take advantage of that and make sure that we do lead, not just in this part of the world, but throughout the world too, especially on the democracy front, because those are our values, and we can't go out and lead in the country if we don't have our values here in America, and trying to do what we can to spread those around the world as well. So those are just some ideas that I thought about. And Catherine, I really appreciate, again, the things that you talked about early on, and I'm happy to take any questions too.
Well, we do have a couple questions already in the chat. First, we have a question for the panel as a whole, so I'll let whoever would like to respond. Do you see a face-saving way for Putin to pull out of the war?
John, what do you think about that? Oh, you're on mute, John.
You have to unmute yourself, John. That lower left corner. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, I thought I did unmute myself.
Yeah.
Too complicated. I do not see, as I'm sitting here now, a way. I mean, that's a diplomatic challenge that is beyond me right now. He's so committed. I think that he's going to start to get a lot of pressure at home, underscoring the mistake that he's made. It may be that he decides he'll take a little piece like he did with Crimea and call that a victory. I don't think President Zelensky will let him get away with that, but we'll see. Some of you have been looking at diplomacy and international relations for a long time. You're probably better prepared to answer that question than me, but looking at it right now, he's suffering a military battery where he's bullying his way in. We've seen these atrocities that somebody will adjudicate as a war crime or not somewhere down the road, but it looks pretty tough to me right now.
Yeah, I agree with John. I mean, it's gonna be hard for him to find much, face saving on this. It may be the case that if Crimea, continues, obviously it's going to be separated from Ukraine for the long term, there's no question. But in the east, if he can hive off some of those at Donbass or whatever, not necessarily make them part of Russia, but somehow create a situation where they have significant autonomy. I don't know if that would satisfy him or not, but that may be a way to satisfy him. I'm not sure. But he's got to make sure that he gets himself into a situation where he can make that demand. And we'll see what happens with this next campaign in the East, because that may tell the tale as to whether he's even able to exert that kind of pressure to be able to extract that kind of concession from Ukraine. And I think most people would agree that Ukraine should forswear membership in NATO. And that's something that Putin has wanted all along. I think it's insane for Putin to think that somehow NATO's a threat to him. I understand why someone with his mindset would believe that. It doesn't make any sense rationally. But he's not always a rational person, I don't think. But I think if Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership say that they will not attempt to join NATO, I think that would help us all in finding some kind of peace there. That's a concession that may be too far for some to go, but it may be one that has to be made.
And I see the whole issue in eastern Ukraine as a really difficult one to have any kind of face saving for on either side. It seems that given the lengthy involvement of Russia in that part of Ukraine, that it would be even harder for Putin to back out of that area than the entire rest of the country, not counting Crimea, which I can't imagine he's ever going to give up.
Right. Mm-hmm.
In terms of face saving, we haven't brought up the subject of the role of China here. And I think it's quite important, because what it's done is it's put people into different silos of support. For example, Prime Minister Modi in India was one of a handful of countries to vote against what Russia has done in invading the Ukraine. India gets now about 57% of its weapons from Russia. It's down from about 75%, and they're still dependent upon Russia for all their spare parts. It's extremely, this is the world's largest democracy, is not lining up with democratic values.
Yeah.
Right next door, Khan in Pakistan was up for a vote for no confidence.
Yeah, he's out.
Well, he's out because he ordered the president to dissolve the parliament.
Yeah.
And that happened for one day. The Supreme Court said you can't do this, so Khan's out. And we don't really know who's in charge of Pakistan at this point. They're also a nuclear country. And then you have the elections going on in France with Macron, who is a staunch supporter of NATO. And is her name Le Pen?
Le Pen,
Le Pen.
Marie Le Pen.
And Marine is anti-NATO, very protectionist. And France is a standing member of the Security Council and has nuclear weapons. So we're trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And China plays a low role here. William Burns, who is the CIA director, John, you probably know him and his reputation. He said that China is very difficult to read, to find out what's going on over there. But he knows that the Chinese and the Russians are in very close communication with each other. China likes to take the back seat here, just as it has in watching what happened or what's happening in North Korea, because in the midst of all of this, China continues its hegemony in the South China Sea, occupying the Spratlys, building these fixed airports, as it were. And China recently entered into an agreement with the Solomons for some type of mutual aid. And at the same time, Australia has a mutual aid pact with the Solomons. So China continues to expand. And the question is, where is China in the midst of this? And we can't really lose track of what their overall goal is, and that is to have the RMB displace the dollar as a world financial trade exchange, and to dominate education, to dominate everything, and at the same time carry on the suppression of the Uyghurs and to ratchet up the oppression of the people who live in China and Hong Kong. So these are all connected. And in the midst of all of this is the world agriculture crisis, and that could take us to another program. You've got questions?
We do have a question about China, which is that given the closer alignment between Russia and China that was established prior to the invasion of Ukraine, if the conflict is prolonged and the economic sanctions imposed on Russia increasingly bite into Russia, what's the likelihood of more active Chinese involvement, such as supplying weaponry to offset what NATO has provided to Ukraine? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
It's you have to look at what China wants out of all of this. China wants to dominate, even if it's the price of a weaker Russia. And so they're trying to play a dominoes game there. Would they give weapons to Ukraine? I'm not sure. John, you're in a better position to answer that than I am.
No, I think this is asking if China would give weapons to Russia to offset what NATO is giving Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that that's in China's interest even to do that, to tell you the truth. I mean, I understand about the impact of the sanctions growing and getting tougher and tougher on Russia. But to Don's point, China thinks they're in charge already. I mean, if you look at their aspirations in the South China Sea and the steps that they're taking there, and look at what the countries there, from Vietnam to Singapore to the Philippines, Australia, and what their attitude towards China, I don't know, because trying to figure out the Chinese is way beyond me, but it just doesn't make sense to me that they would try to insert themselves on the side of Russia in this combat that's going on in Eastern Europe.
Anybody else want to comment on that? We have other questions, or?
I think it's pretty treacherous ground, like John said, to try to figure out what's happening with the Chinese, let alone predict what the heck is going to happen. But I think John makes a lot of sense there as well. I mean, the Chinese are going to push it as far as they possibly can, you know, but they'll get pushback, hard pushback from us on a bipartisan basis here in the United States. There's no question about that.
Right.
They've already failed to comply with some of the trade agreements they made with the previous administration too, as far as, you know, what they were going to send us. So I don't know how much leverage or what they're going to buy from us. I don't know how much leverage we have with them at this point on the trade front, trying to link it to something like that. But I think that's probably what would be attempted. I don't know that for a fact. But I agree with John. I mean, the Chinese are in a good position right now from their standpoint to sort of watch, you know, the Russians bleed, even though they're aligned with them. That doesn't mean that they're good buddies, and you know that it's not like a NATO situation or something. And it's not even like the old Sino-Soviet relationship that existed in the 1950s either. It's not close like that in that sense.
Yeah. So another question, do you think Putin would attempt a chemical or nuclear attack?
What do you think, John?
Well, normally I would say no, because there still is the notion of mutually assured destruction, and at least in the sense that if you do that to us, we're going to do it to you. So if he says, okay, well, maybe I'm just going to use the smaller tactical nuclear weapon, and it's only going to impact Ukraine, I mean, he's unstable enough in my judgment that he might actually do something like that. And then I'm back to my concerns that I expressed a half hour or more ago of how we've got to be very, very careful as we look at this and this whole idea of using tactical nuclear weapons as a kind of extortion. So it takes strong leadership from the United States and from NATO. And he's got to believe that he won't be allowed to get away with that. And I'm not sure he believes that right now.
I think you're right, John. You know, I mean, he's been throwing this out obviously as a possibility. But yeah, most people I don't think most people in America, most citizens don't think about tactical nuclear weapons. They just think of missiles and ICBMs and all of that.
Right.
But tactical will be the battlefield nuclear weapons. And a lot of those are very small, and you can, as John knows, you can launch them, you know, basically handheld launchers, that kind of thing. And they're not a huge impact, but they would be significant because it's a nuclear weapon, obviously. Mm-hmm. I think it's more likely, if he's going to do something terrible, that it's going to be chemical weapons first, and then whether he would, you know, do something nuclear remains to be seen. But again, you know, I think probably our CIA and other folks in the intelligence community are thinking about this all the time, you know, and how far does this guy get pushed before he really feels like he's cornered and doesn't necessarily think he has any choice but to do something like that. And John knows about that, the scenarios that people lay out along those lines. It's something to be very worried about. There's no question about that.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Another question, why do you think so many countries are heading down the strongman path rather than following democratic principles?
It's a lot easier to have an authoritarian system than it is to have a democracy. It's a hell of a lot easier, you know, to have that kind of a system. And it doesn't take nearly as much to have that kind of a system, although, you know, we did have democracy flourishing, you know, when the Soviet Union fell, but not all those countries became democracies. Not all became democracies overnight. Very few, if any, did. In Eastern and Central Europe, as you know, Catherine. But I used to study so-called third world politics, and, you know, so many of these countries around the world, it's hard to build democracies when you don't have societies that either are ready for it or they're so divided ethnically and otherwise that, you know, that power that the central government has, while it may seem sort of insignificant to us because we're in such a big country, it's a big deal in those countries. And so, you know, you get these strong men, usually they're men, who want to take and hold on to that power. And it's very difficult to stop them from doing that. And once they're there, it's difficult to get rid of them.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who are not unwilling to live in an authoritarian environment as long as there are minimal amounts of personal freedom that they can exercise.
That's
That,
right.
you know, this idea of, oh yeah, let's, you know, let somebody else decide all that. I don't want to think about that stuff. I mean, you know, democracy is messy and it takes a lot of work. And I mean, Dave, you might disagree with me on this, but my sense was always that I wasn't at all surprised after the fall of the Soviet Union that there was such high sentiment there for the old days, which
Right.
of course is one of the things that Putin is playing on today. This idea that, you know, somebody else will solve the problems for you and somebody else will fix things and you just don't have to worry about that stuff. And
Right.
when you've got an authoritarian government, you know, I think there are people who feel, it's not really the right word I want to say, but almost comforted because somebody is taking care of them. They don't have to think about it themselves as much.
Like, like you said, so long as they don't go so far as to go out and protest a lot and all the rest. That's why we have to give the Russians who went out and protested initially, and so many who are in prison, I mean, just a tremendous amount of credit. They have to know. They had to know when they went out on the street.
Oh,
what the
absolutely.
consequences for them might be.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And the courage was astounding.
Yes. My favorite, I think, was the person on the news station who went behind the anchor person with the sign that said,
Right.
you know, they're lying to you and all that. I don't know whatever happened to that person. I hope they're still alive, but it wouldn't surprise me to find out that they weren't actually.
Right.
So, yeah. So another kind of political sort of question here. Dave Loebsack sort of touched on this, but at what point does the US say we won't stand for what's happening and step in? Would it take Russia attempting to take another country as well, or China taking Taiwan? How do we rally places like the UK and Canada to push back against Russia before more blood is shed?
I'll go real fast since my name was invoked by the person. The UK under Boris Johnson is already doing a lot, as you folks know. I mean, that was pretty cool, I thought, when he went to Kyiv and marched there with Zelensky. But as I said earlier, I maybe this isn't where we would step in, but I think if a NATO country were attacked by Putin, we would step in. I have no doubt about it. We would be obliged to. They did that for us in Afghanistan. The only time that Article 5 was ever invoked in the history of NATO. We'd be obliged to go in. I don't want my stepson and his wife in the Marine Corps to go overseas and be deployed again and fight for America again. But I have no doubt we would. Short of that, I couldn't say. Others probably have some thoughts about that.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, I agree with Dave. Article 5 would be invoked. And if there was any question about it before, I think that's been removed now because of Putin's invasion of the Ukraine and the whole awareness of the world that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And we're saying, well, because Ukraine's not a member of NATO, we're not gonna go in. The implication there is that if they were a member of NATO, we would. And if you look at just Estonia as an example, little bitty country, million or so people, but a NATO member, if they're invaded, I think we would, and I think NATO itself would act. It's the question about, there are a lot of countries that aren't NATO members, and we're seeing that problem right now.
Another question from that same student was, as a student here, what should we be doing to further educate, but also get people to act? How can we get our current senators to actually do something? And before you answer that, I had another question about what is Article 5?
Yeah,
Anybody
Article 5
wanna-
basically says that if one NATO country is attacked, it's considered an attack by all of them, and that the other countries will come to the assistance of that country.
Right, and it's part of the original NATO treaty.
That's right.
One of the articles there that an attack on one is an attack on all,
That's right.
and everyone is obligated to help.
That's
Well,
right.
Catherine, if I could answer the academic question,
Sure.
I want to thank you for your chairmanship of the Department of Historical and International Studies at Rockford University. The department does a fantastic job on informing the students. The classes are extraordinarily relevant. And what's going on today is really an extension of what your other role is at Rockford University, and that's you and I founded the Institute for the purpose of furthering knowledge everywhere. To the student who asked that question, at what point do Americans feel that there's enough empathy to put pressure on their senators and members of Congress? I think we're past that point, but it's good to remind people continuously of the horror that's taking place in the Ukraine. Donations are down to the charitable organizations and UNICEF that are helping out these the 4.5 million displaced Ukrainians. And I've seen so many people and a lot of students that are really following this quite closely, because this is probably about the most significant thing internationally that has happened during their lifetime. So a big shout out to you, Catherine, and to Rockford University. Thank you.
Thank you. We were also asked why we think it has to be a NATO country, and I'm interpreting that to mean, why are we saying that we would step in if it was a NATO country and we won't when it's not? And, you know, my basic answer to that, and I'll defer to John or Dave or Don or anybody on that one. I think it's because we're obligated by treaty to respond if it's a NATO country, and we're not if it isn't. And in this case, the potential cost of a larger war with Russia is what's keeping the United States and NATO from being more involved than they already are.
Yeah, I just want to, you know, as a former member of Congress, and I'm not trying to take anything away from the other former members who are here and I served with, I was always disturbed, to say the least, when sometimes there'd be discussions about war or the United States engaging in conflict, or before I got there. I mean, I didn't get there until 2007. There was a lot of this kind of discussion. It never, ever, I don't think, was discussed to any great extent, the long-term costs of any commitment of the United States anywhere in the world militarily. We didn't think about that with Vietnam. We didn't think about that with Korea. We didn't think about that in other places.
No.
And that really bothers me, because we have a lot of, I'm not a veteran. I was never in the military, but I visit a lot of veterans' homes and veterans' hospitals, and I have kids in the military and all that. We have a lot of folks that we're paying for right now because they signed on the dotted line and they were sent overseas, and they went willingly or unwillingly, depending on the situation, but they went nonetheless. And I think we have to do a better job of thinking about what are the potential long-term costs of any kind of commitment of a significant degree of significant numbers of troops overseas. That's my preaching for the night. But I think when we think about where we're going to put troops and where we're not, I think we need to think about the long term.
Well, I think, Dave, I appreciate that, as somebody who is a veteran and has been to a lot of those places. I always went willingly, but I understand your thought. But if you look at things that we've seen around the world, and I would put forward, for example, what was going on in Somalia in 1992 and 93, and you had mass starvation. And we saw those pictures. And I know the student probably was a tad too young for that, but it was horrible pictures on television of dying babies and flies crawling on them and just horrifying things. And so we asked ourselves, shouldn't we do something? And there is one sort of approach that says, well, we're not the world's policeman. And there's another one that says, yeah, but you know, we're looking at hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people suffering and dying. Is our role in the world really just to say, well, that's too bad? So I think that's an important question that we as a nation and we as a people need to ask ourselves, because sometimes I think we do need to go in, we can go in, and we can go in fairly quickly and get out fairly quickly, and sometimes we can't. But it's a question we need to ask, and we always need to ask further than we're willing to do. And we talk about Afghanistan as the longest war, but if you'll remember, and I don't expect a student to remember this, when this started, we had a commission that came out and said, well, this is going to be a long war. And in fact, the Pentagon called it the long war, because if you were going to really stop terrorist training, terrorist activities, you weren't going to do it in a 2-year commitment or a 5-year commitment or a 10-year commitment. But those are tough to do. We're a democracy, and these things are going to, we get different administrations, and we're going to argue them out, and things are going to change, sometimes for the better and sometimes not. And just on the lighter side, I found it interesting, and I thought it was a great question from the student, but he said, how are we going to get our senators to do something? And the 3 of us here are all served in the House would say, well, you're not. You're never going to get the Senate to do anything.
But thankfully, they are doing something in this case.
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, sort of. Right. Another question, any significant chance of a coup against Putin in Russia? I think a lot of people are hoping for that, but
who's willing to risk his or her life to attempt to do that, right?
yeah, I don't know. Do we see any chance of that?
Well, if the sanctions, there was a comment that said, I think, well, Professor Lee said that sanctions usually do not work. That's true to a certain extent, but we're starting to see pictures of shortages of food in supermarkets and grocery stores in Russia. And people always vote what their belly is telling them. And so maybe there's this secret hope on the part of President Biden when he talked about regime change, and then he recanted his words, and then he said, no, we do want him out. And he was speaking from his heart, that maybe the country becomes so corrupt that from within, the people take control of the leadership in one manner or another.
You don't always get what you want with the coup, though. I would remind all of us of that. Putin is so bad and so unstable, I don't know that we could lose with that. But if you look at history, and Catherine and Dave, you've looked at this, I'm sure, a long time, but there have been coups and governments overthrown, usually coup d'etat, but maybe in a fixed election, and we didn't like the results that came out of it. So something to think about.
Or we did for a while, but then after a while, it didn't look so good.
Exactly.
Started out okay, but didn't end up okay.
Well, remember when Gorbachev was in his DACA? And the coup almost took place, and they had a deal. I can't think of the Russian premier's name, but he was the big drinker.
Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin.
Boris Yeltsin.
Oh yeah, Yeltsin.
So that almost happened. We've got a bunch more questions, Catherine.
No, I don't think we have a bunch of new ones. I was going to ask Nadia a question. I was curious about So you said that you're still in touch with you have family in Ukraine and that kind of thing. So obviously similarities in the refugee aspect of walking to Poland and that sort of thing. But do you have connections or contacts with people who are still in Ukraine that have stayed, or and do you know anything about what that experience is like for people on the ground there?
My contact is with my second cousin who immigrated here 20 years ago, and he still has very close friends in the Ukraine.
Mhm.
And so I think I spoke to him about a week ago, and what he has heard is that the women have left Ukraine, but the men have stayed to fight.
Mhm.
And I don't think he'd heard anything in the last 2 weeks prior to when I talked with him.
Mm.
It's a very frightening time for Ukrainians. And I do want to address the topic of resilience. I don't know if it was John or Dave that mentioned the resilience that he's seeing. And having grown up with Ukrainian parents who had suffered and had overcome tremendous travesties, I learned through my parents that for 70 years it was illegal to speak Ukrainian in Ukraine once Stalin took over. And yet the Ukrainian people kept the language alive because my parents I spoke Ukrainian with my parents. And one thing I learned from both my parents is Ukrainians have an amazing faith. And I believe, and I don't know if you've seen pictures of these Ukrainian people, so many women just praying on their knees, praying, and students praying. They have faith in God and in themselves. Ukrainians are a wonderful people, and so are Russians. And I don't know how this is going to end. I guess in my heart, I believe the Ukrainians are somehow going to have a victory. I don't know if it's going to be a complete victory, but they fight not just to fight, but they fight from the heart.
Yeah, the interviews that I've heard from people in Ukraine that have been interviewed on national public radio and other places, the spirit that everyone has and the determination, no, we're not walking away. This is our country. We're not giving it up. And that the power of that determination, I think, is going to be really very hard to defeat, totally defeat. I mean, I'm not saying that Russia's not going to get some land out of all this, but they are not going to subdue the Ukrainian people. There's no question in my mind.
No, they're not. So, but thank you for inviting me. Thank you so very much.
I think that human side of it is part of what, we sometimes miss when we think of all the analysis and the military and the political side of it. But it's such a human tragedy that's happening, and the lives that are being disrupted are just, I mean, it's incalculable.
There's something.
No, my cousin actually wanted to go back to Ukraine and fight, but his wife won't let him. So
well, I don't think he was alone. I think they had a lot of people doing that, coming back, and not just from Europe, but lots of, all over the world. Don, you were going to say something?
Yeah, Nada, you're the president of the Illinois Mental Health Council, and you deal with people who have been through lots of trauma, and the I'm seeing something, and maybe I'm an outlier here, of appreciating so much the country where I live. I was talking to my wife, well, we talk every day, obviously. And I said, Frida, I said, do you sometimes feel overblessed on what it means to be an American? And I'm not talking about politics, just the fact that we live in freedom. And these people that you see escaping from the Ukraine, they're wearing nice clothes, Nadia.
I know.
I mean, they've got I don't want to say designer, but they've got good Western clothes, and they were building a democracy. Granted, the average wage is only about $4.50 an hour, but they were starting to turn that corner of democracy. Look at the U.S. when we started. Goodness gracious, the Alien and Sedition Acts. The people didn't know if we could make that first election or second election for the president of the United States. So all fledgling democracies have these problems.
Yeah.
I was in Prague with Frida, and we were standing in Wenceslas Square where the Velvet Revolution took place, and a lady who was our guide happened to be the translator for the poet who became president, and Havel. And I said, well, what happened there? And she said, well, the people gathered in the square periodically, and they took out their keys, and they shook their keys as a symbol that they wanted the key to freedom.
Huh.
And something similar happened in Latvia, in the captive nations, as we call it, where people formed a human chain and started singing, and they called it the Singing Revolution. I mean, there's just remarkable things that take place that you can't even dream of. And I look at this thing as saying that, dear Lord, let something spectacular happen to the people of the world to remind us all of how precious freedom is and how we have to fight for it day by day.
Agreed. We have another question. Russian propaganda has used the Azov battalion as justification for its supposed denazification of the Ukrainian government. How much is far-right extremism and its historical legacy an issue in Ukrainian politics? Anybody want to take that one? I know it's a little over.
No, I think it's there, but I don't have an answer. I can't explain how much it is. Maybe Nadia knows.
I mean, this is from just conversations that I've had with Ukrainians that have come over in the last 20 years. And I would tell you that in the beginning, when when the Soviet Union fell, there was a lot of corruption in the Ukrainian government. We know that. The first Ukrainian president was a Russian. He was more Russian than Ukrainian. The next one was better. And then we finally got to President Zelensky. So I'm not sure about the Nazification. According to my cousin, that is really what he would call Russian lies about Ukraine in order to paint Ukraine as a Nazified country. So I don't believe there's any truth to that. Was there corruption, and is there still in Ukraine politics? Of course. For 70 years, they were under Russia. And during those 70 years, there wasn't a whole lot of education on democracy and how to be a democratic nation. So the politicians there, like my cousin would say, were really more communist Russian than freedom loving Ukrainians. So I think what we're seeing now is the true heart of Ukraine in President Zelensky, where Ukraine was heading, and Russia has stopped it. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I don't know much about the internal workings of Ukrainian politics, so I'm not even going to venture a guess on that one. So,
Catherine, before we close,
yeah,
we want to thank our co-sponsors at the Rockford Chamber of Commerce and the Rockford Public Library. We've
yes.
been partnering with them. I think now this is our 5th or 6th program,
Mhm.
and they have the common goal of using Rockford University as a continuing portal for programs and education and information that's very difficult to get under other circumstances. And then you and I haven't talked about it yet because we plan our programs together, but I'd like to see this fall a big program, and we can bring in some former ambassadors to European countries and NATO and really talk about what's going on in Europe. And John and Dave, you'd be invited to come back and participate in that also.
Hey, thanks for
Well,
having me, Dan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists and all of our guests who came and listened and shared questions with us. I don't see any new questions in the chat, so unless somebody else has something to say, I think we will sign off for the evening and thank everyone for their contributions and their thoughts. And we will all keep sending, I think, good thoughts to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I think we're all rooting for, I think lots of the world is rooting for them, and that can't hurt. It
No.
just can't hurt.
Would it be okay if I said good night in Ukrainian?
Oh, absolutely.
And to thank everyone in Ukrainian?
Absolutely.
Дуже дякую за все і добраніч.
You're welcome. Don't know if that was the right response, but
Nicole, I have a question for you. As we wrap it up, this program is being recorded, and when will the link go up for people to either listen to this again or to send it on to their friends?
Yeah, great question. So the link should be up tomorrow before 5 p.m. and the site will automatically email that link out to everybody who registered, whether they attended or not. And that will be the same link for everybody, so it can be shared, with anybody you'd like to reach out to with the link, or on social media, or anywhere you'd like to share.
And thank you for actually making the mechanics of this possible. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for
Thanks,
having us as
Nicole.
part of it. Thanks everybody so much. It's a great event.
Thank you very much.
thank you. Everybody have a good evening, and we'll see you
you.
next time when we have
Thank
another
you.
program.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.